Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at. I hope your day is going well. I had somebody reach out to me on my YouTube channel or via my YouTube channel. They sent me an email with a bunch of questions, and I feel terrible because I told them, I think it was Sunday, that I would reply to their email the next day. And then I got super busy with orders. I had a bunch of things happen. And then Tuesday I had several meetings that I had to address, and I just felt really bad that I did not get back to this person. David, I hope I'm saying that right. I'm really sorry. This is for you. So I'm looking at your 5 questions. I wanted to do a video response to try to give some more context around the questions that you've got. And I also feel terrible because I did not reply sooner. So let's dive in. First question from you. Do adult beetles eat the media they live in? I notice most people in America that breed mealworms use Bran Pollard as their media. I myself am still trying out different media such as chicken feed, protein around 18%, rejected bread, protein around 6.5%, and dried cassava pulp, 1.2%. I noticed that by weighing the media, the mass didn't change. Don't know if this was the case or because they lay eggs and some of the worms are hatching. So do they only need a drink? To answer the question, the beetles don't eat as much of the substrate that they are in as the mealworms do. They do eat some of it, but not a ton of it. So what I've noticed when we do our beetles, we're putting our beetle trays, we're putting about 500 grams of substrate in there. And I haven't weighed it, but what I know is that after a week of those beetles being in there, most of that substrate is still there because there's not a lot of frass production. There's some, but not a lot. And the bran's not disappearing, right? Like if you put bran in with the larva, the mealworms, they're going to start eating that pretty quickly, and you're going to see the difference in frass to substrate, right? You'll start seeing that. So the requirements for the beetles seem to be much lower from a substrate perspective than the mealworms. I have not tried giving them exclusively water gel crystals or a moisture source because you want them laying those eggs in that substrate, and you want that substrate primed and ready to go for the larva. From a different media perspective, I think it's awesome you're trying different media. The rejected bread, I'm super curious about how that pans out, because one of the things that I would like to do is to integrate food waste a bit more. Unfortunately, in the US, it's not a lot of different reasons for this. I won't go into that, but it's not easy for an individual business to get food waste from a source. It takes quite a bit of we're not even gonna get into that. The other thing that's really interesting here is the dried cassava pulp. So I think like utilizing those two things is an awesome way to use what's around you basically. It's one of the things I really like about mealworms is, I don't have dried cassava pulp here, but it could work, and it could work really well for you. So I think the one thing that I'll end with on this question is, you want to, if you're going to use something that's lower in protein like that for your beetles, when you take those beetles out and the mealworm eggs that are in there start hatching, they need nutrients. And so the higher the protein source you have, or the more nutrients that you have in that substrate, the quicker they will grow. So if you use a low protein source for your beetles in that tray, one thing you might consider is when those shift to just the larva to grow, you may want to add something in there that has the higher protein. So hopefully that helps. And with any of this feedback, Davin, feel free to reach out to me again and provide more context. I'd like to keep going back and forth because there's a lot of good questions here. Number 2. I noticed, and this is Davin's question here. I noticed that you have hydrogel for your worms before sending them to your customer. I'm curious, since hydrogel doesn't have any nutrition at all besides as a moisture source, is it better to give them anything else? I'm giving them tofu for them to drink because I think besides giving them a drink itself, since it contains a lot of moisture, the tofu also has 8.6% protein in it. Don't know whether this is true or not since I'm only a beginner. Yes. Although, yes, to which part of that? Yes, I put in the hydrogel or the water gel crystals during the shipping process. So as I'm packaging those mealworms up, the day before I ship, I will feed them substrate and water gel crystals overnight. And then during packaging in the bags, as I'm bagging them up, I'll put water gel crystal in the bag, unless I'm specifically requested not to. I do have some customers that as soon as they get their mealworms, they're immediately emptying them to feed them for birds, and they were concerned about the birds potentially getting any leftover water gel crystal. So I do have some customers that I don't include that, but I do that because it's a good moisture source. It's not a nutrient source, so I'm not adding anything into those water gel crystals, any sort of yeast or protein or anything that might give it an additional boost. It's strictly water and the water gel crystal. And so it's more of a drink for them as opposed to a nutrient source. And what I found is that helps keep those mealworms less stressed during shipment. Think of it like a human. If you're going to travel from point A to point B and it's a 24-hour journey, if you have moisture and food, you're going to arrive at that endpoint in a better mood and in better health than if you had nothing for those 24 hours, right? And so I choose to take the time in my process to put those water gel crystals in, because the end result is a better mealworm arriving for the customer. And so that's why I'm here, and that's what I'm trying to do. I think the idea that you've got here of using tofu as the water source and a nutrient source is amazing. I think that's spot on. If I had the option of getting food waste and integrating that in without enormous risk or enormous cost, I would be doing that, because the more nutrients you put in there and the more variety you have, the more healthy an insect is going to be. And so what I would caution about is, I'm assuming you're making the tofu as opposed to getting it from somewhere else. Anytime you bring in something from the exterior into your colony, you're going to need to be careful about potentially bringing something in that's hazardous to the mealworms. And so, if anything's been sprayed with a pesticide, even getting vegetables from your next door neighbor, if they've put anything on them, and you introduce that into your colony, it could be detrimental to the health of those mealworms. So be careful where you're getting your tofu from, but if you're making that yourself, the concept that you've got, or the idea you have of giving them a moisture source as well as nutrients, is amazing. 100% would support that, and I would do that here if it was cost effective. One of the things that I was looking at potentially to improve the colony health is adding a nutrient source to the water gel crystals, or doing something like this, like finding something that the mealworms are going to be drawn to eat and get their moisture from, that I can control from a production perspective. So I would make it here, for example, and then feed it to them. So I think you're doing something really awesome with that tofu idea. Definitely curious to see how that pans out and get more context around that. Number three. As I mentioned, for the substrate I'm using above, I assume nutrition does matter, since the worms lived in the chicken feed media. They thrive a lot better, and they're worse in the dried cassava pulp. Can you tell me the nutrition needed for the adult beetle and the worms? Spot on, and that goes to some of the comments I made earlier for question number one. The mealworms need more nutrients than the beetles. The beetle's primary role is to mate and lay eggs, and that is a moisture-driven process, right? Whereas the larvae, their main job is to grow, and so to grow you need nutrients. So they will definitely grow better in the chicken feed. That's exactly what you're seeing, and worse in the dried cassava pulp. I'd be curious, what if you mix all that together? Do you see any benefit of, is there a nutrient in the cassava pulp that's not present in the chicken feed? And that's just my lack of knowledge about cassava pulp. But maybe a combination of those two things together would be helpful. But the nutrition needed for a beetle is extremely low. We touched on that on the first question. For the mealworms, any nutrient source you put in, so the higher the protein, the faster they're going to grow, right? The lower the protein, the slower they'll grow. What you should do is really based on what your goal is and what those costs are. So chicken feed is likely, this is an assumption I'm making because it's the case here, chicken feed is more expensive than something that has less protein in it, like wheat bran, for example, which is what I use. And so the mealworms will thrive, grow, do just fine on nothing but wheat bran and water gel crystals. If you add nutrients into that, so if I were to integrate in chicken feed or some higher protein item, the growth span would reduce, right? It might take me a month and a half to harvest a mealworm instead of 2 or 2.5 months. But my cost is higher. My input cost to get there is higher. So it's a time versus cost perspective. There's no wrong answer there. If you have the budget for it and the end result is a product that you can recoup those costs that you're putting in, go for it. That's going to take a lot of analysis and honestly just some testing. Right now, I'm not messing around too much with different additives. I'm going to post a video soon of a tour of the farm that has a couple things that I'm playing with, but it's not anything I'm seriously wanting to change right now. It's more of just an info gathering, testing just to see what happens. Number 4. How many grams of food do you give to your adult beetle daily? Also, how much food for the young and adult mealworms in their growing stage? I really appreciate if you give me your list of it in days or weeks of the growing worm stage. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for this. It's not data that I collect, and it's not something that I am super concerned about. The amount I feed is really based on, and the amount anyone should feed from a moisture perspective is really based on what your goals are. You know, if you're trying to be super efficient and get the growth rate of those things going, boom, 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 moisture every day, moisture. And you want that moisture gone before you add more moisture. So the amount that you need to add there is going to vary based on how many mealworms are in that bin, how many beetles are in that bin, what your environment conditions are. If you have a lower humidity, you're going to need more moisture added in daily in this example I'm using. If you have high moisture, you're going to need less. And so there's no precise answer here for everyone. Honestly, it's really contextual to your environment, your goals, and what you have available from a cost perspective and a labor perspective. If you have to feed every one of your bins every day to try to get that efficiency, a human doing that, that's going to take a lot of time. Time is money, right? And so if you try to automate that, again, that's a cost and something you have to maintain. What we're doing here is every 2 days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So there is a gap there, Saturday, Sunday. I come in on Sunday and feed things that need to ship out on Monday, or give moisture to things that ship out on Monday. But for the most part, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, every 2 days is when we do our feed of moisture. And what the amount we give is handful, half handful, and then maybe a little sprinkling in the younger trays that aren't getting sprayed water. And so that's highly dependent on, I'm running at 70% humidity, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're doing that hydrogel or water gel crystal every 2 days. So I don't know what a handful weighs, to be honest with you, and it varies based on human. We're not being super strict right now around, making sure 1 cup, for example, or 200 grams, or whatever those things are. And so unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you other than we're giving beetles and mealworms moisture Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then the younger mealworms, I have switched to applying sprayed moisture. I posted a video recently on the YouTube channel about that, but I am spraying those younger trays until they get to the point where the exoskeletons are on the top, and then I switch them over to water gel crystals. The younger trays get a shorter spritz of water, and then it gets more water as they age up. Then we switch them over to water gel crystals. Screensaver came on. All right. Number 5, how many grams of beetles do you usually put for 1 box? How much of the media in those boxes? Most of the breeders here have different opinion each time I ask a different person, so I was kind of confused on how to correctly put them. This is a great question. So What I'm doing right now, I can speak to that 100%. So right now we have the blue boxes that we use from Beacon Camp in the Netherlands. They are 600 millimeters by 400 millimeters by 90 millimeters. I can't remember the exact height, but from a width and length perspective, that's the primary measuring that I use from a how many beetles perspective. So in a 600 by 400 millimeter tray, we are putting 1,500 beetles. And what we do is we routinely manually count out beetles, weigh them, we'll count out 50, weigh them, count out 50, weigh them, count out a different 50, weigh them. It is somewhat boring and monotonous, but that gives us a good average of what the weights are, and then we'll just multiply that out to get 1,500. And then we weigh those out, and then we put them in the bin. So we're not counting out 1,500 beetles for every one of those trays. And so that's the ratio right now. I think it comes out to, and unfortunately I have this in my head in not in metric. It comes out to 384 square inches, 1,500 beetles total in that. And then that'll get you your beetle per square inch or beetle per millimeter here with the 600 by 400. I have found that going above that 1,500, I recently did several tests of actually doubling that. I put in 3,000 in a few trays. I posted that recently as well, the beetle reclamation, as I call it. And I was surprised because I didn't see as much die-off as I was expecting. I had a couple thoughts on that. When you overpopulate a bin, you're going to have cannibalism. You're going to have, fighting for the space that's in there, for the food that you put in. And so I was expecting much more die-off than I saw. What I haven't seen though, and what I'm still waiting to see, is my hypothesis is that the production of eggs isn't going to be double what the 1,500 amount is in a tray is spitting out, because those beetles are likely cannibalizing and eating the eggs because they're competing for all that space. I did it as a test. The beetle reclamation video goes through what that was all about and why I was testing that. It's not a normal process that we have integrated in, we do all the time. So to the rest of that though, like how much media, I believe we're putting in approximately 500 grams. I'm probably going to need to up that though, because what we're finding is as that tray grows, once the eggs are in there and the larvae start hatching, as that tray grows, we're needing to supplement that bin with more substrate, with more media, because we're running out before those mealworms are ready to harvest. And so ideally what I'd like to see from an efficiency and production perspective is we put enough substrate into that bin that we don't touch that bin again from a substrate perspective until we harvest it. That's my goal, and really that's shaped around the labor it takes to put the substrate in, the monitoring of it. I just want it to be more consistent and automated in the sense that once we know what that amount is, whether it's 500 grams, 700 grams, maybe it's 1,200 grams, we're going to test that out a bit to figure out how much we're going to put in for those 1,500 beetles, so that when the bran runs out, the beetle or the larvae in there ready to harvest, there's basically just frass in there, so that's a nice, clean, fast process to sift the frass out. And that way we don't have to take the time to put wheat bran in those bins over and over and over again. The comment about breeders having different opinions in your area about how many beetles to use, really that's something that occurs everywhere. In the mealworm farming co-op group that I admin with a couple other people, lots of really good community members there. I'd highly advise jumping into that group if you're not in there. Mealworm Farming Co-op, CO-OP. That group is a great community that will respond to questions and whatnot. And that's one of the questions we see a lot is how many beetles should I put in? And even within that community, there's going to be a lot of varied answers. 7 to 12 per square inch. I'm not sure what that is in metric, unfortunately, right now. 7 to 12 per square inch is one of the common answers. If you want to look at some scientific research, Juan Ramos Morales did a lot of studies on mealworms. Super great resource to go and check out. But they tested population density of beetles and what the production was in a lab type scenario. And so I can't recall exactly what it was. I looked at that study years ago, and I've modified since then. So I do know that whatever that study put out, I don't know if we stuck to that. I should probably go back and look at that, just refresh my memory, to see what, where we landed. Because what I'm finding is the 1500 in that 600 by 400, there's not a lot of die off until the end stages of that bin, and it's producing a good amount of mealworms. Is it optimal or super efficient? Yet to be determined. So I can adjust the quantities in there, but what we're finding is in a real operating farm, the 1500 in that bin size is working very well. But you'll get different feedback from different people. And honestly, it could depend on setup, the environment conditions. The other factors that could impact that is in a bin, if you're strictly talking just your media, your substrate in the bottom of that bin, there's only so much space for those beetles to move around in. Some people will add things in like egg cartons, cardboard, different structures or things into that bin, and what that does is it actually gives more surface area for those beetles to move around, so they become less crowded. So if I were to take egg cartons, for example, or cardboard pieces and put it in a 600 by 400 bin, I should be able to add more beetles to that tray and not see a higher death rate or a detrimental change in egg production, because now they have more surface area to move around on. So it's very contextual. You might have some people saying you're not putting enough beetles in, or you're putting too many in. Ask questions of, like, okay, what's your setup? Why do you think that that's the right way to do it? And what you might find is maybe they're providing more moisture more frequently because they have the time and the opportunity. And so they're able to decrease the amount of cannibalism of the eggs because they are giving moisture more frequently, right? There's a lot of different variables there that can impact it. So my feedback there is it's going to be very dependent on what works best for you. And so experiment with the different options that are out there to find what works for you and your scenario, what your goal is with raising the mealworms. And there's really no wrong answer as long as your beetles are healthy, your larvae are healthy, and you aren't stressed out or worried too much about what's going on or having issues with getting to your goal. So thank you very much for all these questions. Again, I apologize for not getting back to you sooner. Things got away from me in the last couple days. If you have any additional questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. I wanted to get this on video to provide a bit more context around it rather than type all that out and potentially confuse things. So hopefully this helps. If anybody has any questions, please leave a comment here. I'll respond to everything. And Davin, thank you so much for reaching out. If there's anything else I can do to help, I'll be here.